Buonasera. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this second section of our international meeting. This one now is on the vocabulary used to describe and label the divine. Our main speakers this afternoon are Professor Martin Carrer and Professoressa Daniela Scialabba. Just a few notes about Professoressa Daniela. She received her doctorate in biblical exegesis from the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Strasbourg in France. Her dissertation, entitled Creation and Salvation, Models of Relationship Between God of Israel and the Nations in the Book of Jonah, Psalm 33, either Masoretic text and Septuagint, and the narrative of Joseph and Asenath, was awarded with the Alberigo Prize by the Giovanni XXIII Foundation for Religious Sciences in Bologna. She subsequently served as adjunct professor and researcher at the Faculty of Catholic Theology at the University of Strasbourg. Since 2012, Daniela has been a member of the editorial board of the Historical and Theological Lexicon of the Septuagint, published by Mor Siebeck, for which she has served as scientific coordinator since 2020. She also collaborates in various international research projects on the Septuagint. She is a member of the faculty board of the Dresd National Doctorate in Religious Studies. Together with Professor Eberhard Bohns, she co-edited Volume 2 of the Historical and Theological Lexicon of the Septuagint. Her doctoral dissertation was published by what we call FAT, the Forschungsmalten Testament, by Mor Siebeck, Creation and Salvation, Models of Relationship. Together with Professor Eberhard Bohns and Professor Candidate, they published in Italian La Septuaginta, and then translated into Spanish. It's a book that has received a large diffusion. Together with Professor Pessoa, published New Avenues in the Exegesis of the Bible in the Light of the Septuagint, published by Brepols. Together with Professor Vinel, La Sagesse au Carrefour des Nations, published by Morcelliana. That's, among the more important books. Together with Professor Puchel, she published The Vocabulary of the Septuagint and its Hellenistic Background. This afternoon, for us, she prepared The God of Israel, a God who exercises mercy, consideration on the use of the verb ἐλεέω in the Septuagint, between Jewish Hellenistic literature and the New Testament. Daniela, I probably forgot the more important thing. She's our professor at the Biblicum, of course. Associate professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. Daniela, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much also for this very generous presentation. And I cannot thank the organizers, but I can thank the president that permitted the realization of this conference. And I thank you all for being here. And I'm very happy that you are here. So let's start. The verb ἐλεέω is distinguished as one of the significant terms. It doesn't work, okay? Okay, no, yes. The verb ἐλεέω is distinguished as one of the significant terms pertaining to the divine sphere in biblical text, particularly within the Greek version of the Septuagint, where it is predominantly employed as a term designated God, who in a wide variety of contexts show pity or has mercy towards individuals and more specifically towards his people. From this perspective, the verb is frequently used in its application where it assumes an almost technical value. God is asked to have mercy in particular situation of need, of weakness, not only because he is recognized as capable of mercy, capable of acting where humanity lacks the means to do so, but because he is acknowledged as a God capable of compassion and showing mercy. In this regard, the verb evokes one of the fundamental prerogatives of the Jewish faith, which repeatedly appears in the so-called formula of grace. The purpose of these papers is to analyze the text and context in which the verb appears in the Septuagint, in Philo and Josephus, and the New Testament, while also considering Greek inscription and papyri dating from the 3rd century CE to the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. In doing so, I will seek to identify continuity in the use of the verb across the various corpora. First, starting from the Pentateuch, I will examine the Septuagint, highlighting the corresponding Hebrew terms that ἐλεέω translates in order to determine whether, in what way, the Septuagint share common ground with the coeval papyri and how the verb is used in Jewish historiography and the New Testament. The verb ἐλεέω occurs in the Septuagint approximately 139 times. Its meaning oscillates between showing pity, mercy, and having mercy towards someone. In texts that possess a Hebrew forlage, it primarily translates the following verbal roots: Hanan, Raham, Hamal, and Naham, Piel, Niham. In the Pentateuch, when the verb ἐλεέω refers to God, it assumes the meaning of showing, having mercy. Primarily, ἐλεέω is employed either to express a divine blessing or a promise of mercy. The latter is granted on the condition that Israel observes God's commandments and returns to him after a period of infidelity, or furthermore, as a free act on the part of God. In the case of blessing, the manifestation of divine mercy translates into a form of favor, such as the gift of progeny or other riches, as, for example, in Genesis 33, 5 and 11. Furthermore, ἐλεέω appears in blessing formula in Genesis 43:29. Is found in absolute sense in the blessing that Joseph addresses to Benjamin: "May God show you mercy," and in the formula prescribed by the God for the blessing of Israel in Numbers 6:24-26. Moreover, while on the one hand God's mercy is promised conditionally, such as when Israel puts his commandments into practice, specifically by punishing idolaters, as in Deuteronomy 30:17, or where Israel converts and returns to the Lord with all its heart and soul, as in Deuteronomy 33, on the one hand, the act of God having pity is not subject to any condition. Indeed, within the context of Exodus 33:19, the showing of mercy corresponds to a completely free action of God, who reveals himself here to Moses following the destruction of the first tablets of the law. In the intense dialogue regarding the prophet's request to see his glory, God responds affirmatively, adding, "I will have mercy on whomever I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whomever I have compassion." Finally, in the Pentateuch, ἐλεέω is used twice in a negative sense. In both instances, it is accompanied by a negation. The subject of the verb ἐλεέω here is not called, rather, it is found in the divine commands. In Deuteronomy 7:2, God commands Israel to annihilate and show no pity to the indigenous population of the promised land. In Deuteronomy 28:15, God will punish Israel, but by delivering it to a ruthless people who will not show respect for the elderly and no compassion for the young. In other texts of the Septuagint, the use of the verb in blessing formula is not found. However, It is used in the Pentateuch to express the showing of pity as a gratuitous and free act of God, as well as in negative terms, namely in the context of condemnation in reference to men. Finally, ἐλεέω is also found in other contexts, specifically as a formula used in supplications and texts where God is exalted for his merciful actions. When utilized in positive context, the verb indicates the faithfulness of God who acts with mercy to provide salvation for his people. In this sense, the verb is found in various contexts, whether Israel is in a state of fidelity or in a state of sin. Thus, for example, it is stated in Zechariah 1:17 that the angel tests the prophet to announce to his people that God will not continue to withhold mercy from Jerusalem, but will instead show it by choosing Jerusalem once again. Furthermore, God's mercy is manifested in the face of his people's repentance as they weep before him and invoke his mercy. For example, Isaiah 30:19. In this regard, the acts of God having mercy is sometimes linked to the theme of Israel's new reconciliation with its God, or as seen in Wisdom 11:23, to the repentance of sin. This aspect is connected to the fact that he is capable of forgiving abundantly, as stated in Isaiah 55:7. It is interesting to note that the verb ἐλεέω occasionally recurs in conjunction with a change on the part of God, who will turn and have pity on his people despite their previous wicked conduct. In this sense, the text of Jeremiah 12:15 finds expression. In Jeremiah 38:20, the showing of mercy by God is revealed as an expression of loving care towards Ephraim, and finds its reasoning in the fact that he is precisely the huios agapetos, his beloved son. By virtue of his love, which takes on trait of human tenderness, Ephraim will be brought back from exile. Elsewhere, God's exercise of pity is not something that materializes immediately. Rather, it is promised as a future act that he will perform in favor of his people. Thus, for example, in Jeremiah 37:18, the Lord showed mercy towards the exile of Jacob and promises him a future reconstruction. The promise of return to the land made to the house of Israel as a result of God's compassion is also found in Ezekiel 39:25. Here, too, such a promise is linked to a future act of God who will show mercy to his people. Conversely, ἐλεέω is also frequently used in context involving a judgment of condemnation, where the people are destined to become object of God's wrath. In such case, God will show no pity, for instance, towards the widows and orphans, due to their weakness and injustice, Isaiah 9:17. In these instances, the verb is always accompanied by a negation and has God as its subject. In such a context, it's always God who speaks and declares he will not have compassion on his people because of their abominations. This is evident, for example, in various passages of Ezekiel, where God's wrath is manifested against Israel, which shall not be spared because it has defiled holy things. Ezekiel 5:11. In particular, in Ezekiel 7:6-8, the withholding of pity by God appears to be aimed to a sort of pedagogy. God's punishment must teach the people that he is the Lord, the one who strikes. Similarly, the verb appears in the book of Hosea, where God's judgment is announced against Israel through the image of a daughter of Hosea and Gomer, who shall be named uk ἐλεεμένη, not pitied. In the reasoning behind this name change almost through a wordplay that creates a vocabulary symmetry, it is stated that God will no longer have pity on the house of Israel. They are children of prostitution. Indeed, sin creates a rift, a separation between Israel and its God, such that it turns its gaze away from them, thereby withholding his mercy. Isaiah 59:2. Conversely, it's interesting to note that particularly in the book of Isaiah, the verb ἐλεέω used in reference to God sometimes constitute one of the fundamental aspects that leads Israel to rejoice and exalt God in his glory. Consider, for example, Isaiah 30:18, which stated that God will be exalted for having had pity on his people. And in this sense, we could quote also chapter 44:23 and 58:8 and 9. The verb ἐλεέω appears primarily in the aorist or imperative form within formula of invocation. Within the Psalter, the verb occurs almost exclusively in the expression ἐλεέω με or ἐλεέω εμάς, serving as a fixed and typical formula found in Laments as a translation of ανενού ανενή. Through this formula, the speaker invokes God's pity and mercy to request his intervention in a situation of suffering or prostration in which they find themselves. The cause of such a distressed state for which the speaker invokes God to have mercy on them are varied. For example, because they find themselves humiliated and oppressed by enemies, Psalm 9:14. Due to the presence of the proud, Psalm 122:3, or because of weakness, Psalm 6:3, and because they are lonely and poor, Psalm 24:16, or in face of imminent danger, Psalm 56:2. The invocation ἐλεέω με or εμάς is also found as a request for redemption before God by virtue of the righteousness in which the speaker claims to walk. Also a request for redemption and forgiveness on account of a committed sin. Behind its presence in Psalter, the request for divine mercy is formulated through the aorist imperative of the verb ἐλεέω in other texts as well, featuring invocation from both individuals and collective entities. Such in Judith, Judith 6:19, the verb appears on the lips of the protagonist as she addresses God before facing the enemy. Here, Judith invokes the Lord's pity, drawing his attention to the humility and the smallness of his people in face of the enemy arrogance, asking him to act by virtue of their devotion. In other texts, it is the people of Israel living in exile who address a heartfelt plea to God that he might have mercy on their sin and those of their father. Indeed, their dispersion was caused by their own wrongdoing, as stated, for example, in Baruch 3:2. Finally, the verb ἐλεέω as a human being, as its subject, the capacity to show pity is linked to the righteous state of the individual, as in Proverbs 13:9. In particular, showing pity towards the poor appears as a distinctive virtue. This path leads to the blessedness and establishes that the individual will be recompensed by God with his gift, Proverbs 19:17, or allows the individual to find mercy in turn, as affirmed in Proverbs 17:5. Conversely, those who are impious will receive mercy from no one, Proverbs 21:10, and no one will show pity for their widows, Job 27:15. The verb ἐλεέω appear in the extant Greek papyri starting from the 3rd century BCE. It's found in petitions as well as in private letters, where it primarily assumes the meaning of having pity or being compassionate. It is used above all as a request addressed to someone exercising a greater power than the petitioner, And it appears to be the standard term for imploring an act of restorative justice based on compassion, which serves to alleviate the state of necessity in which the petitioner finds themselves. The petition for mercy through this verb in the Papyri is a part of a fixed formula and functions almost as a technical language aimed at inducing the recipient to act. Frequently, these are petitions requesting release from prison for individuals in extreme condition who claim to have suffered an injustice and fear losing their remaining means of subsistence. For example, such in the first example that you see, petinoris and samois to prisoners who work as swineherds is in a petition originating from the 3rd century BC Egypt. They ask Zenon to have pity on them, ἐλεέω, and to be released from prison because they fear their pigs might die due to their absence. It is interesting to note that these prisoners do not present themselves as being without fault, but rather justify themselves before the authority by exclaiming that, after all, no one is without sin. I skip the second example and I move to Papiro Kaizen 359-418-2, where the emphasis of the plea for mercy is placed on the aspect of suffering. Here, a certain Patiofis implores his employer to release his wife from prison. He reports that his wife is suffering greatly due to their separation. The petition concludes with an invocation to Zenon to have pity on him as well, given that he has always saved everyone and no one has ever suffered any harm at his hands. In the other papyri, where the verb appears, different situations are described. For instance, in Papyrus Kaizen 359-49-10, a petition dating to the 3rd century BC, we find a request from a certain Sfragis. She asks Zenon to write to Leontisco so that she may recover items stolen from her, given that the stolen goods have been located by the police. In this papyri that I presented, the formula is addressed to officials, individuals, or of high rank who exercise power or authority. However, albeit small numbers, the formula is also found addressed to a deity. In UPZ 7824, one of the papyri from the Serapeum of Memphis, dating to the 2nd century BC, the following prayer is recorded, likely addressed to Isis. Come to me, goddess of godness, being favorable to me. Hear me, have mercy, ἐλεέω, on the twines. Among the material evidence, the formula can be found in 2 inscriptions containing an acclamation engraved onto small gold leaves, lamelle. Both originate from Roman funerary context and date back to the Roman period. These represent a request for salvation and protection in the afterlife addressed to Serapis. Be of good cheer, Publicanus, one and only Zeus Serapis, have mercy, ἐλεέω. In the work of Philo, the verb ἐλεέω takes on the meaning of to have pity, mercy, both in relation to man and God. The use of the verb in the Vita Moses is emblematic, where it applies to both human figures and God. Its first occurrence is found in verse 15, in reference to Pharaoh's daughter, who, upon seeing the infant Moses among the reeds of the river, felt compassion for him, taking him with her and adopting him despite his being a Hebrew. In this sense, compassion is linked to an act of maternal love, metron pathos, that transcend ethnic and political barriers, leading the daughter of the enemy, the Pharaoh, to protect a Hebrew child. In another passage of the first book of the De Vita Moses, 1:14-5, the verb serves to define the identity of Moses, precisely because he has pity for the oppressed. In 172, where Philo interprets Exodus 3:7, the verb ἐλεέω appears in relation to God, albeit indirectly. The divine intervention of salvation is presented as a response to the lack of human pity in the world. Josephus, when the verb appears, it indicates a political, legal, or divine act that modify a situation of danger. In the Jewish war, Josephus frequently employs ἐλεέω to describe the action of Roman commanders, particularly Titus. Josephus clarified that the mercy shown to the besieged inhabitants of Jerusalem by Titus was not a sign of weakness, but rather a rational attempt to induce repentance on the side of the instigator of the uprising. However, Josephus also employs the verb ἐλεέω in reference to God, in both negative and positive terms. For example, in the Jewish Antiquity 6:42, the prophet Samuel warns that God will not have pity despite the prayers of the people. Here, the verb underscores the concept of broken reciprocity. Since the people have rejected God for a king, the salvific function of feeling pity is thus taught. In positive terms, Josephus often describes divine intervention as a reaction to the virtue of prayer. Thus, for example, in Jewish Antiquity, 10-200, where he takes up the narrative concerning Daniel, it states that God feels pity, ἐλέασας, for the people in danger and consequently sends Daniel the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. A few verses further, Josephus asserts that such ability is not due to Daniel's own innate skills, but rather to the fact that God, hearing his plea for mercy, revealed the interpretation to him. Let's move to the New Testament. Yeah. Okay, thank you. In the New Testament, the verb ἐλεέω occurs approximately 28 times and takes on the meaning of show mercy to someone, have pity or compassion. About half of these occurrences are found in supplication addressed to Jesus by individuals or groups. The phrasing appears identical to that already encountered in the Septuagint text and the Aprii. Specifically, the formula lesson me e mas, through which a salvific intervention is requested in a situation of particular difficulty in which the speaker finds themselves. In all these cases, except one, such intervention is requested of Jesus, who is often identified with titles like Kyrios or Iuios David. He is asked to have pity and intervene, for example, regarding those possessed by demons. Thus, the Canaanite woman expressed herself in Matthew 15:22, asking him to free her daughter, tormented by a demon, as does the father of the epileptic son in Matthew 17:15. The same formula is found on the lips of those who suffer from physical disability and ask to be freed, such as the blind man in Matthew 20:30-31, as Bartimaeus in Marcus 10:47 and 48, and other lepers in Luke 17:13. In other New Testament texts, the verb appears where the focus is on merciful action, which can have God as its subject, but also human being. In this case, having pity is placed within a sort of reciprocity. This is stated, for example, not only in the Beatitude of Matthew 5:7, where Jesus declared, "Blessed the merciful, for they will receive mercy," but also in what he asserts through the parable of merciful servant in Matthew 18:33. Here, the verb ἐλεέω appears twice in the rhetorical question that the master addresses to the wicked servant, reproaching him for the fact that he should have had mercy on his fellow debtor, just as the master had mercy on him when he was in the same difficulty. Furthermore, the verb ἐλεέω in reference to God occurs in the letter of Romans. In chapter 9, Paul cites Exodus 33:19 to explain the action of God who is faithful. The fundamental question concerns the Jews who have not accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Paul explains that the word of God is infallible, so his mercy is not diminished. He fulfills it, as he said to Moses, upon who he decides. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. Upon this freedom of God, Paul makes dependent the reason why some in Israel have accepted Jesus and others have not. For Paul, this hardening observed among the Jews takes on a pedagogical value. It is functional on the one hand to the conversion of the Gentile, who receive mercy thanks to the Israel disobedience. On the other, to the Jewish themselves, who will obtain mercy since he has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may be merciful on all, as it affirms in Romans 11:30-32. In this text, where the verb ἐλεέω appears 3 times, 2 of which are in the passive voice, the theme of receiving mercy is dominant and serves to emphasize the positive action of God in contrast to human action. God's strategy consists in using human failure as a space in which to manifest his compassion. In this context, heavy pity on God's part manifests as a loving, salvific action that is completely gratuitous. The passive form of the verb occurs in Paul's words in reference to his own person, once in 1 Corinthians 7:25 and the first letter of Timothy, where Paul, who introduced himself as the author of the letter, affirms that Jesus Christ, the Lord, judged him pistos by calling him to the ministry, even though he was previously a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a violent man. In this text, Paul becomes the demonstration, the fact that Jesus Christ came to save sinners. By granting him mercy, Jesus wants to provide an example of his magnanimity. Conclusion. In light of the text examined, I shall now provide a brief synthesis of the conclusions that can be drawn from the analysis conducted. The action contained the verb ἐλεέω can be attributed to a human being, but in the biblical text, the verb is most often used to define the action of God, who in various contexts shows pity, mercy, or conversely withholds it due to the infidelity of his people who disregard or transgress his commandments. In the Septuagint text, the present or future of his people, who may or may not be able to subsist, depends on whether or not God show pity. From this point of view, the act of pity sometimes follows an obedience to him, while at other time it is presented as a sovereign act of God who acts toward his people, moved solely by his love and freedom. In the New Testament, this aspect of God's gratuitousness appears on the lips of Paul, who speaks of his being trustworthy thanks to the intervention of God who had mercy on him, despite his weakness and his persecution of Christ's followers before his encounter him. The use of ἐλεέω in the blessings found in Pentateuch is no longer found in the New Testament. Rather, in the New Testament, more than being present in the form of a blessing, is found as a macarism through which Jesus declared happy those who have mercy because they, in turn, will find it. Although it's not a very frequent use, ἐλεέω is found in this sense once in Proverbs 14:21, where it is stated that he who has pity on the poor is supremely happy. in contrast to those who instead dishonor the needy. The aspect of reciprocity is found in the Septuagint, particularly in the book of Proverbs, not only in Proverbs 75, where a sort of retributive pity is affirmed when it says, "He who has compassion will find mercy," but also in other passages from the book of Proverbs, where having pity towards the poor will have as its counteralter God's favor towards the human being who acts in this sense. A particular use of the verb is found in texts containing its applications. In these, the formal ἐλεέω me or emas function as a fixed formula and takes on a functional value so that the plea may find a hearing from the sovereign official on duty in petitions of the Ptolemaic era. This formula addressed to the divinity occurs in some extra-biblical textual witness of Ptolemaic and Roman periods, but in the case of the Septuagint, it is always addressed to God. It cannot go unnoticed that in this regard, the same formula in the New Testament is addressed to Jesus, who is recognized as Son of God. Conversely, however, the verb ἐλεέω is never found in the lips of Jesus, speaking of himself as one who has shown pity. From this point of view, the New Testament diverges from the Septuagint, although it shares the same ἐλεέω me emas modalities directing it towards the divine authority. It is interesting to note that in the New Testament, the verb never appears on the lips of Jesus nor of God. Rather, in the parable of the unmerciful servant, the action of having mercy assumes a character of exemplarity that serves to mediate the discourse on God's forgiveness. Just as the father has mercy on his servant, so do the servant must have mercy on his peers. In part, this element of exemplarity returns in words placed on Paul's lips in 1 Timotheus. This aspect is not found in relation to the use of the verb ἐλεέω in the Septuagint. Finally, the Jewish literature in Greek, the verb is employed both in reference to man and God. In Philo, the Vita Moses is acting with pity that characterized the development of the history of salvation relative to the history of Moses. In Josephus, the pity of God becomes almost an instrument of war diplomacy. Where God acts in positive terms, it corresponds to his immediate response to the prayers of those who behave with the ἐλεέω, like Daniel. In negative terms, it is a reaction to those who, in turn, do not show the same pity. Thank you very much for your attention.
And I'm calling here Professor Martin Carrer, probably well known for several of you. Professor Martin Carrer is a German theologian and professor emeritus of New Testament studies. He received his doctorate from the University of Erlangen in 1983 with a dissertation on the Book of Revelation. In 1988, he completed his habilitation with a study on the title of the Messiah. From 1990 until his retirement in 2020, 6 years back, Professor Carrer served as a full professor of New Testament at the Wuppertal University of Applied Sciences, where he also held the positions of rector and vice-rector. From 2009 to 2020, he directed the Institute for Septuagint and the New Testament Textual Research at Wuppertal. His research areas include Christology, the interpretation and critical editing of the New Testament writings, especially the epistles of the Hebrews, and the Book of Revelation, as well as theological aesthetics. For our students here present, for our young future scholars, I have to mention a very important thing. Professor Carrera is the chief editor of the Critica Major edition for the Book of Revelation. So please, in Italian we say mi raccomando. Okay. Mi raccomando. Since 1998, Professor Carrera has been a member of the editorial board of the journal Kerygma and Dogma. Together with Wolfgang Krauss, he directed the Septuagint Research Center at the Wuppertal Ecclesiastical University of Applied Sciences and at the University of Koblenz. He has also served on several scientific advisory committees. I just mentioned 2 or 3 titles that are very important. Jesus Christ in the New Testament, I am mentioning that because it's translated into Spanish and into Italian, okay? The Septuagint in German, Textual History of the Reception of Scripture in Early Christianity, Die Johannes-Offenbarung als Brief, Studien zu ihrem literarischen, historischen und theologischen Ort. Very important, der Codex Reuchlings sur Apocalypse. This is a Critica Textus. And of course, Revelation, Novum Testamentum Grecum Editio Critica Major, published recently, 2024. Professor Carrera, it's a pleasure to have you here at the Pontifical Biblical Institute. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. And I must say now it is late, but I'm afraid I will need the 35 minutes. Excuse me. Yeah. So, can there be change or development within God? It is easy to answer this question today with yes. Many of you will know at least the title Gottes Sein ist im Werden, God's being is in becoming, by Eberhard Jüngel. That's the modern times. A branch of ancient philosophy was convinced that there cannot be immutability in an ever-being God. The old church developed this idea of the immutabilitas Dei, which became consensus up to the 18th and 19th centuries. Nobody expects that an editor of the New Testament, an editor of Revelation, will encounter that question, but that is the case. My paper takes us to a faraway world. Sorry, but I thought it is maybe interesting in some way. Since that is indeed the matter, what is happening? According to the actual edition of Nestle Aland, the 28th edition, God speaks from his throne in the end of Revelation, gegonan. One moment. We do the best. Yes. Gegonan. Es ist geschehen, it is done. King James Version or Luther. The preceding verses tell that the present heaven and earth pass away, and in the next passage, the heavenly Jerusalem comes down. I learned when I had my studies in the 1970s, that is the exemplary place for the apocalyptic time of break. It has done. Human history, heaven and earth fall into the realm of becoming. God, on the other hand, is taken from becoming. This rendering of Revelation 21 rests on shaky ground, one of the famous places of apocalyptic tradition, as has been known since Lorenzo Valla, the great humanist who worked here in Rome in the 15th century. In 2024, the text was amended by the Editio Critica Major of Revelation, and Nestle Aland 29 will follow the Editio Critica Major. What is happening? I will sketch the history of edition and look for the theological consequences. So you will wait for this part of the presentation. I start with Lorenzo Valla. During the last decade of his life, Lorenzo Valla compared Greek and Latin manuscripts of the New Testament here in Rome. He discovered the medieval Latin text of Revelation 21:6 has factum est. It has done. it is done. But the Greek text reads, Gegona, to alpha kai to omega. Two manuscripts from the Vatican Library offer Waller's wording, a Koine manuscript and a manuscript with a commentary by Andrew. We don't know if Waller used these manuscripts or other manuscripts in Rome. Every manuscript I could see in Rome has Gegona, not Gegona. Concerning the interpretation, he knew that ginestai is often used similarly to enai, but the perfect tense, Gegona, has a plus against the present eimi. Waller decided to render the tense and translated factus sum, also in his annotations, factus sum, I, God, have become. We have it in the 15th century already. Or fui alpha et omega, I, God, have been, alpha and omega. How does this fit with the theological conviction that God is immutable? Waller knew of this problem and articulated it. But he articulated it not in 21:6, he articulated it at 1:4. There God is mentioned the first time in Revelation, and we have charis apo hoon, grace by the one who is, and we have a break in the casus. And Waller is writing, an voluit Johannes in Deo significare immutabilem proprietatem, by this missing inflection of God. Maybe the author of Revelation thought of an immutabilis Deus, but he gave not the priority to this idea. The priority is on the movement within God. Why was Waller lost? It was not lost by the Complutensian polyglot, but lost by Erasmus. Erasmus is famous as the editor of Lorenzo Waller. Therefore, he by sure knew Lorenzo Waller, but he did not follow him. He created a conjecture. And up to today, the Erasmus text is a conjecture. None of the manuscripts used in the Editio Critica Major of Revelation has the Erasmus text Gegone ego eimi, it is done, or es ist geschehen, as Luther would say. Erasmus retranslated the Latin text. And Erasmus, I must add, concealed the theological reason for his amendment. He claimed in a confusing annotation, which the editor of Erasmus could not understand, and which I can't understand, that the manuscript would show the same text. The manuscript used by Erasmus is known. It is now in the Library of Augsburg, and it is showing Gegona. But Erasmus is writing, you see, ego Gegona to alpha kai to omega noster codex consentiebat. Moreover, he's not only writing noster codex consentiebat, but he is writing in the annotation Gegona. There are two possibilities. One is Erasmus was working so quick that he didn't understand what he wrote. That is the proposal of Braun. Yeah? Or the other matter is he wanted to give a hint on the conjecture. He said, we have our manuscript, it writes Gegona, and an old version of the Latin text may have the same text, Gegona, but I am writing Gegone. Then he gives a hint to his conjecture. Neither of these possibilities is plausible today. But we are not living today. Nobody asked in the 17th century. I looked to all the sources. That is a public text. It says the first edition of Erasmus, 1516, was edited with the annotations. Everybody could read these annotations. I'm not sure if Luther knew these annotations. He used the edition by Gerbel without the annotations. But later on, Melanchthon or whoever and the translator of the King James Version, everybody could use the annotation by Erasmus and could ask. Nobody did so. It was a good text. It seems to me that the readers of Erasmus tolerated the confusing annotation since they were convinced the Bible can't speak of a change and the becoming in God. It was a new consensus. There can't be the text, God is becoming. It must be the text of Erasmus Gegone. I go on to Beza. Stephanus and Beza did not correct 21:6. That text was fixed from now on up to the beginning of the 19th century. I must discuss Beza nevertheless, for he made an important exegetical contribution. He read the book of Revelation against a Hebrew background and corrected the text of 16:5. What does this mean? Hoon in Revelation 1:4 references Exodus 3:14. The two phrases in the verse, hoen kai hoerchomenos, do not appear in the Septuagint. These two phrases, these are the problem. And Beza had a good solution. He was convinced the author of Revelation is thinking here of, he said Jehovah, of the Hebrew name of God. And the Hebrew name of God is invariant. He is ewig, he is always the same. Consequently, he interpreted 1:4 as a Hebrew reference, and I think many exegetes up to today are not knowing that they follow Beza in thinking that the author of Revelation is thinking more in Hebrew than in Greek. Yeah? And then he went on and he said, but we have the Septuagint text. And the Septuagint text is giving the Hebrew meaning. And we have in Hebrew the allusion to 3 times. And he reconstructed a text in 16:5. We have in 16:5 the first full reconstruction of a Greek translation for Exodus 3:14 for all dimensions. It is not the Septuagint, it is the completed text of the Septuagint. God is hoon kai hoen, not God. I must correct me. There we read hoon kai hoen kai hosios. No, until today hosios. Kai hoesomenos, according to Beza. He introduced it, that was translated in the King James Version, therefore it is a normative English text up to today. How could Beza do this? He decided the following: 16:5 can't speak of God himself, it must speak of Christ. Why did he do so? We can say that Christ has a becoming, but we can't say so of God. Let us look for a moment into the Greek formula of 1:4 and 16:5. Who is, who was, and who will be, or who is becoming. If we compare it to the Greek tradition, I compare it now to Plato, we see the following. According to Plato, Timaeus, the eternal being, he aidios ousia, must be described in the durative present by estin, or the equivalent, the durative present only of on in the Septuagint. On the other hand, the past tense and the future tense estai denote movements, Plato says explicitly, kinesis, a becoming within time, and chronogenesis. If Beza is using the formula hoon, kai hoen, kai hoesomenos, he is speaking of kinesis and of a genesis within God that can only be said Christologically. So, Beza. If we leave Beza, we must say it is evident that the book of Revelation is not thinking Platonic. Yeah? We don't have the ever-being God who is different, who is far away. No, we have a personal God who is in, we will see, in becoming. What does it mean? I can't go on immediately to the interpretation since I must go on in the history of addition. I made only a hint to the Greek theologians. There will be no surprise that Gregor of Nazianz prepared the meaning of Besa and proposed already that 1:4 even, Revelation 1:4 is speaking of Christ, since we have time dynamics there. Yeah. I go on to the 19th century. Maybe you would expect now that the 19th century is going on from Gegone to Gegonan. No, we have two steps of correction of the Textus Receptus. The first step is Lachmann. He rejected Erasmus' conjecture. Gegone has gone away. But Lachmann distressed all minuscule manuscripts as well. Therefore, he ignored the evidence for Gegona that had accumulated over time and stuck to the only majuscule of revelation he knew. This was the Codex Alexandrinus with the reading Gegonan, ego eimi, it is done, I am the Alpha, etc. We have one witness for Gegonan. The numerous changed against Erasmus, not the meaning, therefore the old translation, Luther, and the King James Version stayed up to today. The Codex Alexandrinus stood alone and used an untypical young plural form. The normal plural is gegonathin, not gegonan. Yeah? And normally, if you look into Greek stylistic grammars, you will find gegonan must be very young. Yeah? It is late antiquity or so. Therefore, today we would ask, is it a scribal error if you have a singular reading? But then Constantine Tischendorf published the Sinaiticus. You see the Sinaiticus here, and you see there Gegona, that is the first hand. The first hand of Sinaiticus is showing the normal reading Gegona as the minuscules known since Vala. Then a corrector came, and he evidently had a problem, yeah, thinking of a becoming in God, and he tried something. It seems that he wrote a Nuther. But if you write a Nuther into the Codex Sinaiticus, you get Gegona, I have become ego, the ego, I have become the Alpha, and the Omega. Also, I have become the ego, the Alpha, and the Omega. The corrector thought that must be a nonsense. Yeah? And therefore, he tried a better solution and deleted Gegona. But up to today, you find in the apparatus, in the normal apparatus of revelation, you find now the evidence for Gegonan must be Alexandrinus and Sinaiticus a corrector. That's a real problem, and I looked for the Greek New Testament 6 editions, which has been published within the next month, at least in the last month, and you find there even Gegonan.ego. That is a construction of a different text. I make it now, I make it very short, since you can read the decision of the Editio Critica Major in the edition itself. You will not be astonished if I say it is the evidence for Gegona is very convincing. You have the most witnesses, 4 or 5 big strands. Yeah? You have the oldest quotations, as you have the oldest Codex 101, if you take the first hand. Yeah? You have the oldest quotation, a quotation by Origenes. I will quote it afterwards. And you can explain the correction in the witnesses who have Gegonan. It seems that Alexandrinus made a mistake, and that mistake was successful, yeah, since it fitted very well to the new theology. And the younger witnesses, every of the younger witnesses has Gegonathin. The Editio Critica Major used electronic support, and the electronic support is showing that the manuscripts which have gegonasing are not only younger, but they don't have a strong connection to Codex Alexandrinus. So we can say that the variant gegonan or gegonasin is a result of a theological improvement. The first matter was not an orthodox correction, it was a normal mistake, and that normal mistake became, so to say, an orthodox correction. But only so to say, since we now have to return to the question, why has a majority of witnesses gegona? You have heard this from Waller onwards. Yeah? Not only the old witnesses, but the majority of the late Byzantine witnesses in a time when the immutabilitas Dei was widespread have that reading. There are, as far as I can see, two strategies. The one strategy is a very easy strategy. You don't interpret it. That was a strategy by Andreas of Caesarea, the most famous commentary. He gives the text, but no interpretation. And the second way was you give an interpretation, and that way was started by Origen. Therefore, I now come to Origen. You must know, revelation was far widespread in up to about 220, 230, and then came the chiastic discussion, and from then onwards we have the problems. But Origen used revelation together with the Gospel of John. What did he do with our text? Origen combined 21:6 with 1:17 to 1:18 and attributed the word gegona to Christ. Since he's saying we have gegona to alpha kai to omega, he arche kai to telos, that can be said already of Christ. See into chapter 1, 17 to 18, and so we have the start of the Christological transfer of the motive with Origen, not with Gregor of Nazianz. It's very, very old. Nevertheless, his interpretation of the central statement in 21:6 is groundbreaking, as far as I think. He explained gegona to alpha, a letter, kai to omega, again a letter, he arche, the beginning, and to telos, the end, in the following way, a very easy way. Alpha and omega are human letters. Even if they refer to God and the heavenly realm, they are grammata, as Origen says. And arche and telos are first and foremost concepts. They are onomata in time. Arche means the beginning of something, followed by a second, third, etc., as Origen says, until the end. Anyone who applies the letters and the terms must be aware of this limitation. A is the first human letter. We are within the world, within the alphabet, within the time. And arche refers to the beginnings that we humans can perceive. Therefore, the letters and the phrase arche kai to telos encompass everything that lies between the beginning and the end, but they do not transcend the beginning and the end. Origen reads revelation in a very strong and exact way, more exactly than we are accustomed. Origen clarified the matter by drawing a comparison with John 1:1-5. He emphasized that the logos referred to in the gospel is en arche. The logos is, according to Origen, before the creation, and therefore he is working in the creation. He is en arche. He is not the arche. Explicitly, I think I quoted here. Explicitly, he is saying, kat hod de logos estin uk estin arche. Insofar as Christ is logos, he is not arche. Therefore, we have a problem with our text, even in Christology. Yeah? Even the Christology of the old church must think more. According to Origen, Christ's self-representation in Revelation 21 is nevertheless legitimate, for it enters, like all biblical predicates of Christ, into the conceptual framework which can be conceived by humans between the beginning and the end. Origen did not return to the word gegona from Revelation 21:6 explicitly, but we can summarize the idea. Christ has become the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, so that humans may perceive him in the span from the beginning to the end, and in this perception lift their gaze from the earthly existence. Also, A and O are made for the sake of humans. I did look in the longer form of the paper for the reception of Origen. The most important reception is the commentary of Aretas, but I skip that. I go on to the interpretation. As you see now, I think we must take into regard the observations which were made by Beza and the observations which were made by Origenes. And we must think of A and O in a strong sense. What will be the result? I do it in some points. First, the distance from Greek ontology. I can summarize here. From the very first verses, the text of Revelation moves away from the notion of God's immutability. Revelation 1:4 draws on the Greek text of Revelation 3:14 and emphasizes a personal understanding of God, as we saw. God is hoon, he is not the Platonic, ever-being abstracts. Toon. Point 2, the perfect tense of gegona. God's word in 21:6 is characterized by gegona. Lorenzo Valla drew attention to the past tense. He translated factus sum, I God have become. And nowadays translation may be more cautious, as ginestai is often used similarly to einai, and the resultative nuance of the verb perfect tense must be taken into account. But in every case, gegona includes the result of I have become. The God of Revelation integrates a dynamism of history and becoming into his being. One may paraphrase, the God who is eternal has, out of his very being, become the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. We can refer from there to aspects of Revelation's narrative, can say that way the theology can integrate a high Christology. God has a becoming in his being, and therefore high Christology can be integrated. And he can integrate in his being the aspect of history, therefore we must speak in Revelation not of an apocalyptic break of time, but of a development in God himself when the time comes to an end. But the most important point is, as I think, the point 4, the transcendent God and human language. God says, if I look to the whole sentence, gegona ego to alpha kai to omega he arche kai to telos. I have become I myself, the alpha and the O, the beginning and the end, or I have integrated the alpha and the O, the beginning and the end. What does that proclamation mean if we take into regard the observations of Origenes that alpha and omega are letters of the human alphabet and not transcend the human alphabet? The point is prepared by Revelation 1:8. All thinking, speaking, and calculating from the first to the last letter of the alphabet is rooted in God, maybe in God's name, if you read ego, imi, to alpha, kai to omega, and you find iao, the pronouncement of the name of God at that time. So you find there the letters. You find letters there. And from there now we take the step to 21:6. And you see the progress. The progress, a me is replaced by a go. God is stressing, a go, I, myself, but not a me now, I have become. So therefore it is explicitly said, God has become or God has integrated a becoming. And it is referring to letters. He's referring to letters. I myself have integrated the alpha and the O into my being. And I did so from the beginning to the end. So I think we can take the conclusion, if we are convinced that the author of Revelation was a theologian, that he intended to say, God does not merely grant humanity the letters, with which they can refer to his name and can speak, calculate, and think in time. No, more. God places himself within these letters, and the use of the letters between the beginning and the end of the time. Therefore, the use of these letters is not only correct in a human sense, it is correct in a theological sense. God has become, he has given birth to these letters. We do not know whether the author of Revelation intended a complex linguistic, theological reflection, yet in substance, a theologically relevant point emerges, I think a point relevant up to today. God legitimizes the human alphabet and guarantees that human words, despite their professional nature, capture him, his name, and his relevance for every human thoughts, meaningful in time and space. Do we have a moment for hermeneutics? Sure. Genau. I did here since that interpretation depends from the segmentation, from the punctuation. If you are looking into the Greek New Testament 6 and you are thinking, I said, you can punctuation, gegona, I have become, and then you can say, ego emi. Also, you make a dot after gegona and then add emi, and you have the same meaning as in 1:4. None of the Greek manuscripts did so. We did not find any Greek manuscripts with this segmentation. Every manuscript has the same segmentation that is starting, as far as I think, with the Sinaiticus, gegona ego to alpha kai to o. Hermeneutics. We are reaching the limits of exegesis. The exegete can demonstrate that Revelation draws upon Greek writings of Israel and so on. But was the author of Revelation already a theologian, thinking of the relevance of language? We can't say so, but it's of interest to reflect, to test what would be if we would do so. We would come in the following direction as far as it seems to me. John, the narrator of Revelation, alludes to God's name and claims to have visions of heaven. Even God's throne becomes visible to him. Viewed from the outside, the transcendent God defies any possible human description. The heaven, the throne, etc., can't be put into words if we leave Revelation for a moment. Therefore, Revelation is so strange for many people, and on the other hand, it's so famous for many people. Revelation does something which is strange. Yet the narrator dares evidently to describe images which can't describe if you are thinking very strong of the human language. He knows that his words can't capture the otherness of God, and he is nevertheless convinced that God legitimizes the description. The verse 21:6 is read within Revelation the legitimation for his own writing. I, God, have integrated human letters into my being, therefore human letters are words tentative, suitable for my description. The human letters of Revelation are suitable for the description of God. If you are reading Revelation as a literary book, it fits very well if the author is giving that explanation in the end of the book. Yeah. Sometimes I think, now I'm not the editor, I'm the commentator, as you see, I think that is a very, very deliberated composition. It is tempting to link this observation in the end to two famous statements from modern philosophy. Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote in the final sentence of his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, worüber man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. If I am right, Revelation remains silent on the abstract being of God beyond human perception. You can't speak, and you will not speak, of that dimension of God. On the other hand, Wittgenstein conceded 3 sentences earlier, es gibt allerdings Unaussprechliches, dies zeigt sich, es ist das Mystische. There is indeed the inexpressible. This shows itself. It is a mystical. Revelation takes the view that these inexpressible, mystical matters shown by God can be described. For God himself legitimizes speaking of him in human letters. The Revelation fills the mystical dimension of Wittgenstein's essay. I skipped the conclusion since I saw that you could follow the contribution. Thank you for hearing me at that late time.